The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. And we say hello to Jessie Ulibarri, who's a former Colorado State Senator, progressive community leader, and executive director of the State Innovation Exchange, also known as SIX. Jessie Ulibarri, thank you very much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks for having me. Excited for the conversation.
Our pleasure to have you with us. Now, many of our listeners may not even know what the State Innovation Exchange is, so let's start there. What is the mission of SIX?
SIX exists as a resource and strategy center for progressive state lawmakers. Most folks don't know this, but progressive state lawmakers very often have no paid staff, are working maybe with part-time volunteers, and representing millions of Americans. And so at SIX, we make sure that legislators are prepared to lead by, with, and for the people they represent. We provide training, customized research support, and a whole host of other program offerings to make sure that progressive legislators, as they head into the hard work of governing, have the resources, supports, assets, tools that they need to do their job well. SIX has been around for almost 6 years now, and we support over 3,000 progressive state legislators across the country. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization, and we focus in on our values as progressives, making sure that legislators are fighting for a resilient, healthy, prosperous future that benefits all of us, not the wealthy and well-connected.
Mm-hmm. Well, tell us about some of the specific kinds of assistance that you offer progressive state lawmakers.
State lawmakers are tasked with the important and difficult job of writing public policy and making sure it's responsive to the needs of the folks in their community. But they're also key in helping to build a broader movement. And so we see our role as making sure that we're breaking the disconnect and the distance and distrust that happens in the state policy-making process. Some of the work that we do with state legislators is to provide issue briefings. And an example of this is making sure that folks know that there are national trends moving throughout the country, how they can respond, and providing customized policy research support to help them in that regard. In last year, we did a Fighting for Families Week of Action, where we shared information about the fight for paid family and medical leave, expanding earned sick days, and making sure that legislators were fighting for the kinds of things that would support working families. Those webinars would allow legislators to see what was happening in other states and not just learn about the policy issues alone, which is important, but learn about the strategy. How did a state take on this big fight against corporate America? How did they advance the policy? And then what was the outcome? How did that actually improve people's lives? By doing that kind of cross-state connection and learning, we're getting legislators the tools they need to be successful, not just an understanding of policy, which is essential, but moving that to actual ideas around strategy, implementation, coalition building. The other thing we do is trainings that are skills-based. Oftentimes we'll have folks who are brilliant and visionary leaders who are stepping into this role, and they ran a really hard campaign, but they may not be experienced in some of the challenging things of elected life. How do you do case management, for example? Many state legislators are working with folks in their communities who are accessing state services. Other times, it's how do you actually engage your constituents in a meaningful way and build up the deeper connection between elected officials and the communities that represent. Hosting a town hall a month might not be enough. We'll provide services like teletown halls where we'll help legislators call into their districts and make sure that folks are hearing about what's happening at the state capitol. I think that's one important thing for folks to realize is that very rarely folks know who their state representative or senator is. They can often name their member of Congress or their U.S. senator or who's at the top of a ticket for the presidential race, especially in an exciting year like this. but very rarely do they know the folks who may live down the street from them who are representing them at the state capitol. And so we do a lot of work to make sure that legislators are building that deep connection with their constituents. And then they're able to actually move big, bold ideas that immediately improve people's lives.
Yeah. I'm always amazed that people don't know their state lawmakers, and yet they know all the lawmakers on a national level. And quite frankly, I've always made the argument that state lawmakers are the ones you really want to be paying attention to because they're right there, as you point out, in your own backyard. Now, Jessie, some have compared your organization to ALEC, which is the American Legislative Exchange Council, a conservative group that promotes Republican legislation in the states. How is your organization similar and different to ALEC?
Yeah, I like to think of us as the anti-ALEC or the ALEC killer, but not the ALEC of the left. And I think it's an important distinction. ALEC is an organization that has been used by the right to destroy our economy and our democracy by consolidating wealth and power from a very limited set of perspectives. They are a pay-to-play model where their corporate interests or their social conservative interests can make a play, and then they push out model policy, copycat legislation in every state, like danger ground laws, of which we saw in Florida. And that is incredibly destructive. It centers power in a small set of hands, and it is incredibly detrimental. And I think that's the thing that we have to focus on. The tactics that they've used, the way they've oriented to state legislative power has been harmful for all of us. And so we are not the ALEC of the left, and we don't aspire to be because of the kind of harm they've done. But at the same time, we are an entity working in the progressive movement space, specifically with state legislators. So we're operating in the same space. And we're working with legislators on really understanding national trends and policy. But we're not a pay-to-play model. We receive our funding from individual donors, from grassroots partners, and from others. And all of that's available public online at stateinnovation.org. And we're not pushing our own agenda. What we're looking to do is for individual state legislators to be working in deep partnership with their local organizing ecosystems, that they're building relationships with their neighbors and their constituents and advancing a people-centered policy agenda. So that kind of orientation is significantly different. We also aren't pushing out model bills. We are helping people understand how folks have tackled really difficult issues and then customizing that support in state. And an example here is last year when we saw the slew of anti-abortion bans moving through the South, we were able to alert folks about the kinds of things that were happening in those states. And it put additional state legislators on notice that they had an obligation in this country, not just to act alone thinking about what was happening in their state, but that there was a national effort to restrict abortion access. And so by sharing information across state lines, we had legislators from southern states talking to legislators in northern states about the importance of codifying protections and making sure that abortion access could remain possible in this country. It's that kind of cross-state connection, deep understanding about the national ecosystem that is essential for legislators to be successful across the board. And so our model functions different. We operate in the same space, and we are focused on the long game of building power by, with, and for the people.
And as I mentioned at the top of the interview, you yourself have served as a state legislator in Colorado. From your experience, how important is this kind of assistance that SIX can offer? And did you have that kind of help when you were in office? It's
a great question. For me, I was someone who came into the work as a state legislator from organizing. I'd worked on issue campaigns and ballot measure work in my home community, and had the great pleasure of representing the area where I grew up, including the trailer park where I spent my earliest years of life. And what I found as a candidate running for office, I could reach out and receive assistance and support to learn how to knock on doors and to raise money and to win elections. But so much of our attention in the progressive movement is focused on people to win election. And the day after the election, many of those resources disappear. The support for governance, which is very different than being a candidate, were virtually non-existent when I started. But fortunately for me, as I started, SIX launched. And so my career with SIX and being a state senator have been intertwined, and I've been able to see the kinds of support that SIX offers to grow. I'll give an example here. I finished my election on a Tuesday. I was elected. On the Thursday of that same week, I had to step into the Capitol for the first time to be sworn in and to make a vote on leadership elections. Most of the folks who helped me get elected were taking vacation. My bills that I had to file to be considered in the next legislative session were due a week after that. And so the kind of pace that legislators are required to maintain after election, I give this analogy. Oftentimes we think of the work of getting into elected office as a marathon, and that is true. Folks have to run the race, they have to win the race to be able to move forward. But this is a triathlon. It's not a marathon alone. So if our movement orients to the idea that it's just about running and winning a race, we will have folks who know how to run and win elections. But then we have to get them in the water, and they actually have to swim. I know the order is wrong for a triathlon, but just come along with me with the analogy. The day after the election, folks jump into the water. They have to swim in governance. They have to understand budget processes. They have to understand a very complicated state system. And without support, and if we're only focusing on running the race and not about swimming in governance, we're going to be where we are today, which is that very few folks are prepared to jump into the role of public life without support. And that's where 6 comes in. We focus in on governance, and we also focus in on the next stage, the next part of that triathlon. Getting on the bike and riding it means we actually have to have folks prepared for the implementation of their work. It's not just about the passage of policy. It's about protecting those wins, refining those wins, and making sure that those things can be safeguarded for generations to come. And 6 fills that unique gap. There are 7,383 state legislators in the United States, and we provide support and say, we're here to help you think about policy, to think about governance, to make sure that you can be successful in a position that most folks ignore. And uniquely, those supports have been incredibly successful. This year, we launched the Progressive Governance Academy. So as folks finish their election, they can jump right into trainings with us. We can teach them how to set up their office. We can teach them to do community agenda setting and think about this idea of collaborative governance. Those kinds of resources are essential to the success of progressive legislators as they think about building not just their career, but the kind of world that we all deserve. And 6 is right there to do that work. For me, it was really helpful when I launched my career in elected life that I was able to rely on 6, that I could connect with other legislators who were grappling with similar issues, who I could call upon and say, how does this work in your state? How have you thought about this issue? How can I think about this differently for myself? And that's the kind of network we support across the country.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Jessie Ulibarri. He's a former Colorado State Senator, progressive community leader, and executive director of 6, which is the State Innovation Exchange. Jessie, once Donald Trump took office, there was an acknowledgement that more progressive work needed to happen at the state level. How has that paid off, and where have you seen success?
There has been significant attention at the state level, and we've seen success. A great example most recently is in Virginia, where there's been strong attention paid to the idea that we need to build state power for progressives and then win on the issues that folks care about. But Virginia is not alone. We've seen gains in nearly every single state since the election of Donald Trump, of progressives being very loud on the issues they care about, whether it's climate change or abortion access or working on protections for our democracy. States have been leading the way. I think where we've seen the most success is when folks realize that the kinds of things that they may be fighting for or believing that should happen through Congress or the U.S. Senate, those kinds of victories can happen tomorrow in some states if they're done at the state level. The fight for paid family medical leave, changing the minimum wage requirements and having wages go up for all working families, extending overtime protections. Those are active conversations happening in state capitals all across this country. And we're also seeing the state legislators take on the mantle for voting rights and making sure that we're rooting out corruption. The big things that most folks believe our federal government should focus in on are being addressed at the state level. And that goes from immigrant rights protections to LGBTQ protections. We saw a dozen states pick up LGBTQ protections, including things like gender identity documents. The issues that voters care most about, that people care most about, can turn into reality with sustained support from folks on the ground and moving legislation. But I think it's really important to note that there's a significant concern here. There's an inverse relationship between federal power and state power. And if progressives only think about winning election in November at the federal office, and the focus is in the presidential office, and folks, let's say that there is a progressive in the White House come November 2020, there's a natural tendency to say everything is fine, let's walk away. But Trump and Trumpism alone won't be fixed if we have a progressive in the White House. There's sustained work that has to happen in state capitals and with our neighbors every single day to beat back these ideas of fascism and corruption that I think have just been raised to the surface. And the most immediate impact and the way we can have those enduring wins is at the state level.
Yeah. Now, there's another way to understand your work is to look at a single issue. And climate change is one of the issues you focus on. This seems so much bigger than one state. So what can get accomplished at the state level, and how does SIX help?
Yeah, this is a great example. In regards to climate change, state legislatures control 2/3 of all U.S. Discretionary spending that's not military assistance. And so that means that states individually have significant financial capacity to make investments or to change policy that can do significant work on protecting our climate and protecting our planet. And this is everything from making adjustments in water quality and water protection to sustainable agriculture and requirements around soil quality. These are all things that are within the purview of states to do, and they could be doing it immediately. We provide resources and supports to individual states as they request assistance on the kinds of policies that could be available. But we've also done a lot of work to help nationalize some ideas and support. So when, for example, President Trump pulled out of the Paris Accord, we gave a set of resources back to state legislators about what they could do to try and honor those commitments that we've made as a country by moving those into state policy rather than depending on the federal government. That's the kind of power of states working in close coordination and collaboration, thinking about the responsibility not just to the residents within their districts, but across the country. And that's where SIX comes in.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've also trained thousands of progressive activists, campaign managers, and elected officials on how to create change. Obviously, you believe change is possible. But what do you say in this moment to progressive activists who feel, I don't know, maybe their hope is slipping away?
Yeah, I've been doing this work for nearly 2 decades and started out as an organizer. And the first time I went into the state capitol, I went to go testify for our in-state DREAM Act to make sure that undocumented students can be treated as in-state students in Colorado. I testified as a U.S. citizen, shared my concern about the folks in my family, the people in my community that I was concerned about. And after my testimony, the Republican chair reported all of the undocumented folks at the committee to ICE. It was one of the most devastating personal moments for me, and I lost significant hope. But it pissed me off enough to say that this is not how power should work, and our government, our public structures should serve everyone in our communities. And so I went back to the Capitol every single year and fought for that bill. And when it didn't pass, and when Democrats had power, and it still didn't pass, I got pissed off enough to run for office myself. And in my first year in office, I got to chair the full Senate when we passed it into law. And I think that's important for me to share in this context, to say we might feel in one moment that we've lost hope. But if we lose our momentum, if we lose our focus, we won't see the things change that we want. And it does take not just 1 year or 2 years or 3 years. It can take a decade to realize the kinds of things that we want for our people, for our communities. And it's that kind of tenacity that we have to have in this moment. We can have, a momentary setback. We can have disappointment, but it's better for us to focus on how we can build every single day. And I'm heartened by the folks that I've trained, where I see them struggle 1 year, 2 year, and then win big structural reform. Some folks who've been able to take on the biggest corporate interests and win, or, implement some big scale programs that immediately improve the lives of the people that they represent. And that's what we're fighting for, an America that is healthy and prosperous and that we all benefit from. And I know it's possible because I've helped to do it. And so I encourage folks who are listening to the show to go out, meet your state elected officials, know who your state representative and senator is, and then put into practice this idea that we can change the world bit by bit, day by day, by being tenacious and ferocious and joyful in our pursuit for justice.
Yeah, I mean, change doesn't happen overnight, so you just got to stick with it. And I think it's wonderful what you've done with SIX, and we wish you continued success, of course. Jessie Ulibarri, former Colorado State Senator, progressive community leader, and executive director of the State Innovation Exchange, known as SIX, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Jessie, we appreciate your time. We'd love to have you back and talk more about it down the road.
Would love that opportunity. Thank you so much.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
In corporate speak, there are no, quote, job cuts. Instead, firings are blandly referred to as employment adjustments. Now, though, corporate wordsmiths will need a whole new thesaurus of euphemisms, for masses of job cuts are coming for employees in the higher echelons of the corporate structure. Don't look now, but an unanticipated result of the ongoing pandemic is that it has given cover for CEOs to speed up the adoption of highly advanced RPAs, Robotic Process Automation, to replace employees once assumed to be immune from displacement. As one analyst told a New York Times reporter, with RPA, you can build a bot that costs $10,000 a year and take out 2 to 4 humans. Prior to the COVID crisis, many top executives feared a public backlash if they pushed automation too far too fast. But ironically, the economic collapse caused by the pandemic has so discombobulated the workplace and diverted public attention that corporate bosses have been emboldened to rush ahead. While the nationwide shutdown of offices and furloughing of employees has caused misery for millions, one happy purveyor of RPA systems notes that it has, quote, massively raised awareness among executives about the variety of work that no longer requires human involvement. He cheerfully declares, "We think any business process can be automated," advising corporate bosses that half to two-thirds of all the tasks being done at their companies can be done by machines. This is Jim Hightower saying, conventional corporate wisdom blithely preaches that all new technologies create more jobs than they kill. But even these Pollyannish preachers are now conceding that this robotic automation of white-collar jobs is being imposed so widely, suddenly, and stealthily that losses will crush any gains. The Hightower Radio Lowdown is brought to you by the Lowdown Happy Hour, now live streaming on Facebook from the Chat and Chew Cafe. So grab a libation, pull up a virtual chair, and join our freewheeling conversations with political mavericks, musical agitators, and kick-ass grassroots groups. The Lowdown Happy Hour will connect you to good trouble activists who are building people power across America. Get the Lowdown at hightowerlowdown.org.
Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. And we say hello to Anthony Hensley, Democratic member of the Kansas Senate, where he has been the minority leader since 1996. Senator Hensley, thanks so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Sure, happy to be on.
And we're happy to have you with us. You know, if we were to go to Kansas, talk to residents about the GOP tax plan, we shouldn't be surprised if we hear, been there, done that. That would be in response, of course, to what is widely referred to as the Kansas tax cut experiment, a series of dramatic tax cuts enacted by Republican Governor Sam Brownback in 2012. What was Brownback hoping to achieve?
Well, the term Kansas tax cut experiment was Sam Brownback's own term. I mean, he was on the Morning Joe show on MSNBC, and that's exactly what he told them, that this was a real live experiment. And I guess he decided he was going to use Kansas taxpayers as the guinea pigs in this experiment. And what he was hoping to achieve is to implement the advice that Arthur Laffer gave him. Arthur Laffer was hired on for $75,000 to be a consultant. Arthur Laffer is the father of the trickle-down theory of economics, and he advised Brownback to go in and to cut taxes on LLCs, limited partnerships, down to zero, go to zero for them, and then dramatically cut individual income tax rates, reduce our tax brackets from 3 brackets down to only 2, and there would be this great growth in jobs and the economy in Kansas. And so he basically started out, with the idea that it would be a great economic boon to the state if we cut taxes. And State of the State messages, he said, "Look out, Texas, here comes Kansas," because obviously, people in Texas don't pay, but they do have very high property taxes. And of course, they've got the oil reserves as their resource in order to fund state government. And so as a result of this Arthur Laffer tax philosophy, it just became an absolute disaster for the state's budget and the state's economy.
Well, and talk about the real impact of the tax cuts on the state's economy.
Well, the real impact was the job creation never occurred. We had multiple problems trying to fund the basic core services of state government. In fact, we had to make a lot of different budget cuts as a result. And the economy just did not perform like Arthur Laffer and Sam Brownback had predicted. And one of the other unfortunate parts of these tax cuts is that we ended up having to do away with the mortgage interest deduction. These were the so-called pay-fors. We did away with the child care tax credit. These items that taxpayers, particularly lower and middle income taxpayers, benefit from, we repealed a number of those things in order to pay for the Brownback tax cuts. The prediction on the LLC zero tax was there'd be about 191,000 small business people take advantage of that, when in fact there were 338,000. So it was pretty apparent to me and others that people were just changing their tax status in order to avoid paying taxes. And of course, the big beneficiaries of these tax cuts were the multinational corporations, the Koch brothers particularly, which is based there. Koch Industries is based in Wichita, and so they made out like bandits under the Sam Brownback tax cuts.
And of course, the promise of the tax cuts to businesses is that they will respond by investing in jobs, but that just didn't happen, did it?
It didn't happen. The example that was frequently used was doctor wouldn't pay taxes on his non-wage income, and yet his nurse and the receptionist, people who work for him, would continue to pay income taxes. And when you have, attorneys and doctors and engineers and people that really don't have a lot of employees on the payroll, they're more self-employed. The tax benefit that they get would, allow them maybe to take a vacation down in the Caribbean or do other things aside from being able to hire people. Because if you get a $10,000, $15,000 tax break, that's not enough money to employ people or to even employ one person. So the job creation aspect of this never did materialize.
We're speaking with Anthony Hensley, Democratic member of the Kansas Senate, where he has been the minority leader since 1996. Senator, a remarkable thing happened this past June. A GOP-led legislature actually got together enough votes to pass a veto-proof rollback of Governor Brownback's plan. How did that happen?
Well, it was over a combination of many fiscal years that we had to go through where we had to make cuts to the budget. I've always used the example that 2007, 08, and 09, when the nation was going through its greatest economic downturn since the Great Depression, our budget shortfall in those 3 years was $600 million. But in 2013, after the Brownback tax cuts went into place, our budget shortfall in just 1 year was $700 million. So it had a disastrous effect on our budgets. We had to cut schools, social services. He had to continue to raid from our comprehensive highway fund. We had passed the 10-year Transportation Act that we passed in 2010. And that, of course, was before Brownback became governor. And, at the end of the day, he had raided $2.7 billion from our highway plan in order to pay for his tax cuts. And in addition, of course, we repealed the mortgage interest deduction, the property tax deduction for income taxpayers, and also the child care tax credit. And so I think with this much misery and this kind of disastrous performance or hit to our general fund, moderate Republicans were successful then in the 2014 elections and came into the legislature then with the idea that they were going to try to roll back the tax cuts. And that's exactly what happened. The Senate changed from it being a very conservative legislative body to a more moderate body. And with more moderates in both the 2014 and the 2016 elections being elected, they were fed up with the problems we were faced with our general fund. And so they decided to override their own Republican governor in order to roll back these tax cuts.
Many see this as a cautionary tale to proponents of the GOP tax plan now working its way through the U.S. Congress. How do the two plans overlap?
Well, from what I understand, there are a lot of similar tax cuts in the congressional plans, both from the House and the Senate. I think, again, they're going to try to go dramatically decrease taxes on LLCs and limited partnerships, and dramatically increase rates. And I really think that Congress would be wise to follow the example of Kansas and not do what we did, because it'll have a disastrous effect on general fund obligations that the federal government has in their budget. They'll have to be cutting their budget in order to pay for the tax cuts. That's exactly what we had to do. And I just don't believe that they should follow our example. I would paraphrase what Sam Brownback said about Texas, look out, federal government, here comes Kansas. And that's a warning. You don't want to emulate what was done in Kansas at the federal level, because it's going to have a very adverse impact on the federal budget.
Yeah. Kansas, of course, is now in the early stages of a 2018 gubernatorial race. Governor Brownback is expected to step down, and already a record number of candidates have indicated their interest to take his place. With that in mind, what do you expect to be the long-term political impact of the Kansas tax experiment?
Well, what I hope for in 2018 is that we will again have success in electing both Democrats and moderate Republicans to the Kansas House of Representatives, and certainly reelecting those who, had the political courage to override a Republican governor's veto on his tax plan. If we have those kind of political successes, then we'll be able to keep, moderate thinking in place, and we'll be able to continue funding the general fund obligations that we have at an adequate level. The other issue we have in Kansas is we're under a court order right now. Our school finance system has been declared unconstitutional for, I believe now, the 12th time in the last 10 years. And we're going to have to come up with additional resources in order to adequately and fairly fund our schools in adherence, in compliance with this court order. And so that's another issue we're facing in the immediate session in 2018, even before the election. So, and then we've got, I think, good candidates on both sides of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans. Of course, I am a Democrat, and I'll support our Democratic nominee, but hopefully we'll be able to elect a governor that will be more in line with moderate governors, both Republicans and Democrats, that we've had in the past. I would hate to think that we would elect a governor that was as conservative or even more conservative than Sam Brownback in 2018.
Okay. Anthony Hensley, Democratic member of the Kansas Senate, where he has been the minority leader since 1996, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Senator, we do appreciate your time with us today. We wish you the best of luck, and hopefully we can talk to you again soon.
All right, thanks.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
A lot of Americans are wondering, and I'd like to ask you first, why is it so important for the United States and our European allies to be defending Ukraine, standing up for Ukraine?
Well, I think it's useful to start at the beginning, really, in 1945, when after two world wars, the United States really collectively decided that it was an American national security interest that Europe be peaceful and stable. And with the threat of the Cold War, we took a lot of actions to try and help do what we could to preserve peace and stability, NATO being the most important in Europe, but a variety of other things as well. Now, with the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union, many of the countries in Eastern and Central Europe that had been under Soviet oppression during the Cold War came to NATO and said, look, we want to join, we want to be Western in our values, and we don't want to come under anybody's dominance in the future. And I think this is important to understand, because NATO, we didn't expand NATO to get close to Russia. It's the countries of Eastern Europe that said, we want to be free countries. We want to make our own decisions. We want to have collective defense with like-minded people. That's what we did. Now, the breakup of the Soviet Union complicated this, and as it turns out, we ended up with a gray zone of countries between what I'll call NATO's eastern border and Russia's western border. And to take the three most at issue today, it's Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova. NATO never made a collective decision where to stop, in effect. And I think that strategically was a mistake on our part, because any gray zone like that, any ambiguity is going to be an opportunity for a Freudian slip, Russian adventurism.
Right.
And I think that's what we're seeing now. George W. Bush in April of 2008 proposed bringing Ukraine and Georgia, which is another part of the gray zone, into line for very rapid NATO membership to help eliminate this ambiguity. The French and the Germans rejected that idea. And then through a lot of other history, including an earlier Russian invasion in 2014, we are where we are now. A lot of people say, but Ukraine's not a NATO member. We should, not in our interest. We shouldn't care about it. You may not be a NATO member, but the security of Ukraine directly affects the security of a lot of other NATO members in Eastern Europe. They know how important this is. I like to ask people, well, if Russia invaded Finland, would you say that's none of our business either? So it's not that we have any obligation by treaty to defend Ukraine, but when the security of Poland, of the Baltic republics, of others in Eastern Europe who are NATO members is adversely affected, and we can see that based on the attack yesterday on a Ukrainian facility 15 miles from the Polish border, a Russian victory in Ukraine is going to undermine peace and stability in Europe, and it's going to threaten our NATO allies. That's why it's of interest to the United States.
Does it impact the security of the United States directly?
Yeah. Yes, I think it does. Again, it comes back to the basic premise. Maybe we were wrong in 1945 that peace and security in Europe is not in America's national interest, but I don't think so. And, this is a question, well, it's okay, they can have Ukraine. Is it okay if they have Finland? Is it okay if they have Poland? This is the sort of thing that goes to the question why really NATO should have made a more conscious decision. Are we prepared to press NATO membership right up to Russia's borders, or are we going to leave a gray zone that can be open to exploitation? And for those who say you don't want to get too close to Russia, that's an argument that West Germany should not be in NATO, because after all, it abuts East Germany where there are Russian troops. This sort of idea that if you happen to be close to Russia, you fall into Russia's sphere of influence is an argument that proves too much. Does Canada, should we take over Canada because it's in our sphere of influence? Obviously not. I mean, this whole idea that Ukraine isn't any of our business because it happens to have people who speak Russian in it and border with Russia. It's a very simplistic way of looking at our national interest, I think.
And as we speak, I believe this is day 19 of the war in Ukraine, Putin's war against Ukraine. How do you assess the situation so far? Are you surprised at the resistance of the Ukrainian people?
Well, I am. I think there are two aspects. Number one, I think the Ukrainian resistance has been heroic. I mean, incredible bravery against odds that look to be heavily stacked against them. And knowing because President Biden said unambiguously in early December that no U.S. troops would be involved in this, they have stood for the independence of their country. And I don't want to take anything away from their bravery, but the second major aspect is this has been a catastrophe for the Russian military and its reputation. I mean, I think their strategy was bad. They were after too many targets with too few troops. They violated the maximum of concentration of forces. They've not employed their air force effectively. Their logistics have been horrible. Running out of food and gasoline just a few miles from their own border, or the border of Belarus when they came across. Apparently untrained troops, bad morale, bad leadership at the tactical level. And I think one consequence of this is that it drives Putin to continue the fighting, because leaving Ukraine aside, the hit to the credibility and intimidating factor for the Russian military has just taken a brutal hit here. And for Putin to stop before he can say, I have achieved victory, whatever victory is in his definition, would be negotiating from a position of real weakness. So ironically and tragically, the failure of the Russian military in the first 3 weeks could well prolong the conflict so that Putin and his entire security structure are not totally humiliated.
You touched on something that a lot of people are asking, and I'd love your take on what does Putin want? I mean, does he want all of Ukraine? Does he want a land bridge through eastern Ukraine to Crimea? Any idea? What do you think his ultimate goal is?
Yeah, no, there are a lot of theories, and I don't think we yet know the answer to it. I think his attack on Kyiv can only be explained by a desire to overthrow the Zelensky government and put in some kind of puppet government. I don't understand why you want to have tanks in battles in urban streets. I don't understand the logic of that. I don't get what he thought they were trying to accomplish. My view has been, wrongly or correctly, I might as well say it again because I've been saying it for months. I think what he really wants is to take over the predominantly culturally Russian areas of the country, the eastern and southern parts, which are predominantly Russian-speaking, predominantly Eastern Orthodox, as opposed to the Ukrainian-speaking and Catholic western parts of the country. Now, there's no bright line that divides these two. It's the country's like a case of measles when you look at language and religious affiliation. But I think in particular, Putin wants the North Shore of the Black Sea totally under Russian control. He wants the port of Odessa, and he wants to link up with the Transnistria Republic in Moldova, which runs up the eastern bank of the Dniester River, where there are still Russian troops to this day. And I think when I say the eastern part of Ukraine, it's a pretty big chunk. It's much beyond the two so-called autonomous republics that are there now. But if he were to have that, I think he would be prepared to declare victory. Now, I don't see Zelensky agreeing to that unless he suffers much more of a military setback than they have so far. So, notwithstanding the peace negotiations, which are in their fourth day today, I don't anticipate those coming to any conclusion soon, because I don't think either side at this moment sees it in their interest to do that.
So you don't think today a diplomatic solution is possible or likely?
I don't see it without more fighting. I mean, it's an unpleasant reality, but some conflicts only end when one side wins whatever it thinks its objective is. And I think that's where we are for quite some time, possibly weeks, maybe months. I hope that's not true. And look, if the Russians suddenly found a bright general with a little daring and a little competence, maybe this would end earlier, but none of them seem to be stepping up. And those who come to the front, which, by the way, when a 1 or 2 star general does that, that's a mark of bravery, if not desperation, where several of them have been killed. The Russians don't seem to be poised for any breakthroughs.
Again, our guest today on the Bill Press Pod is Ambassador John Bolton, former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations and former National Security Advisor under President Trump, Ambassador to the United Nations under President George W. Bush. So, Mr. Ambassador, are we doing enough, in your judgment, the United States and our European allies to assist Ukraine? And if not, what else should we be doing?
No, I don't think we're doing enough. I think the basic problem, and this is it's history now for the Ukraine war, but it's critical, I think, for U.S. policy later, especially in Asia, dealing with China. The basic failure, and it's a failure we now experience every day, is we failed to deter this invasion to begin with. It's certainly the case that we've imposed, and we and the Europeans and others have imposed significant sanctions, but let's be clear. We can't say we're happy about this situation. We can't say, well, it's true the war started, our deterrence failed, but boy, we're really whacking the Russians with sanctions, and we're okay with that. We're not okay with that. What we wanted to do was stop the war, and we failed. And we failed for a couple of reasons that are significant for Ukraine, but as I say, significant elsewhere. Number one, our credibility was not good. We did next to nothing in 2008 when Putin invaded Georgia and split off, coincidentally, two parts of the country as autonomous republics. We did next to nothing in 2014 when Putin invaded Ukraine for the first time and annexed Crimea and set up these two autonomous little statelets in the eastern part of the country. And third, I think the withdrawal from Afghanistan, not just its implementation, but the withdrawal itself was a strategic mistake that I think convinced Putin that we were in a period of withdrawal. The U.S. was in a period of withdrawal, and that he could accomplish his objectives in Ukraine at very little cost. Now, that also assumed, I think incorrectly, that he could do it quickly, which he obviously hasn't done.
Right.
But number two,
can I just jump in there just for a second? Do you think in between some of those events, do you believe that the infamous telephone call with President Trump and President Zelensky, where he said, well, we have some aid coming your way, but only if you agree to do this investigation of then candidate Joe Biden, did that send any kind of signal to Putin?
Yeah, absolutely. And it had a very detrimental effect on one of Ukraine's highest priorities, which is establish a good bilateral relationship and a good relationship between the two presidents. And from that moment, from the summer of 2019 forward, when Zelensky came in as a new president, all the way through the 2020 election, Ukraine was the subject of debate in American politics, and had no chance whatever to establish a normal bilateral relationship that could have built confidence in Ukraine, and shown to the Russians that our relations were growing closer and that we very much had Ukraine's security in mind. And I don't think in the year since Biden was inaugurated, unfortunately, a lot changed, other than that you didn't have the erratic nature of the Trump presidency threatening NATO and generally disturbing things. But to make up for that disturbance in the force took time and distraction, and I think was one of the reasons Putin didn't think that we were ready. But the second, not beyond credibility, I just don't think the package of sanctions that we threatened Russia with and all the rhetoric about alliance unity was sufficient either. I mean, we don't have alliance unity. We, for example, now belatedly have sanctioned Russia's oil and gas sector. Absolutely the right thing to do. We should have done it earlier. Germany is not, and most other European countries are not. Even though we have frozen many Russian foreign bank deposits, new euro and dollar payments are being made to Russia as we speak for the continuing delivery of oil and gas through the European system. And I think this is the kind of loophole in the sanction that gives Putin confidence that he can continue. I've been a strong proponent of sanctions in a lot of different situations in Iran, North Korea, the Maduro regime in Venezuela. We've imposed sanctions of equal or comparable magnitude, and those regimes are still rocking along. So, it's the best day for most sanctions is the day they're announced, and then you have to enforce them. And the target of the sanctions doesn't just sit there and take it. They find ways to avoid the sanctions, to mitigate the effect. And that's what's going on now, and it has not been enough to hit Russia really where it lives. And I think this is it will cause pain to Russia, but it's not going to stop the war. And long term, I fear that memories in Europe and for some in the United States will be short enough. They'll say, okay, well, the war's over. Come on, we got to get back to normal. And the sanctions will disappear.
Are there other actions we could take? What about it's debated in Congress right now, the no-fly zone? Even some Democrats are saying Biden should do it.
Well, again, if you go back to what Biden said in December of last year, he just took American forces off the table. And unless he reverses himself on that, which is possible, you can't do many of the things that we should have been doing. I think just leaving the ambiguity, saying like in the famous phrase, all options are on the table, leaving that ambiguity in Putin's mind would have gone a long way. I think there's a fallback from a full countrywide no-fly zone, a kind of humanitarian no-fly zone in the western part of the country. I mean, as we speak, the latest UN High Commissioner for Refugees estimates is 2.8 million refugees, meaning Ukrainians who have crossed an international boundary into Poland or another country. And that doesn't begin to count the number of Ukrainians who are on the move now away from their homes. They're called internally displaced persons. A week or so ago, I heard an estimate there of 1 million. I bet it's higher than that now. There have been projections of 5 million Ukrainians becoming refugees. That's more than 10% of the population. So a humanitarian no-fly zone in the western part of the country to stabilize that flow, to minimize the burden on the Ukrainians who have left their homes, to minimize the burden on the neighboring countries makes some sense. But it requires putting planes with weapons in the air. And if Biden's serious, I don't think he's going to do it. I think we've made other mistakes. I think this decision not to provide the Polish MiGs is inexplicable. There's no military, moral, or legal distinction between supplying javelins and stingers and many other things we're doing. Intelligence for Ukrainian military planners, cyber warfare assistance to their counterparts in Ukraine. There's no distinction that would rule out those MiGs, and maybe they're not the best planes in the world, but Ukrainian pilots know how to fly them, and there's a matter of attrition in the air going on. We can have great Ukrainian successes, but they've only got a certain number of planes, and it's a lot less than the Russians can bring to bear.
I hear you on a humanitarian no-fly zone. I want to be clear, U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine, you would support or not support?
I would have done that going back to December, not necessarily to fight, but to train and be with the Ukrainian military. And figuratively, so those Russian generals looking across the border through their field glasses would have seen a lot of American flags and said, I wonder what that means. There's an argument here. The president himself has made it that if there's any kind of contact between NATO and Russian forces, we're at all-out war in Europe. Right. That's simply not true. It's risky. It's dangerous. It's risky to supply stingers and javelins. They kill Russians just like those MiGs would. So if Putin wants a pretext to escalate, he's already got it. I'm not suggesting that actual hostilities here are in anybody's interest. But if Putin can deter us in a way, we failed to deter him, and now he's deterring us. It is not the case that if one American looks cross-eyed at one Russian, we're at World War III. That's a classic non sequitur. There are lots of levels in this escalatory ladder. We need to think this through carefully. I'm certainly not at this moment advocating precipitous action. But the fact is, Putin says, I'm going to put my nuclear forces on heightened alert, and people in the West start swooning. Now, we just had testimony from the heads of the intelligence agencies last week that they have seen nothing that indicates any change in the status of Russia's nuclear forces. It was a bluff by Putin. It was a threat that we succumbed to. And the more threats that we succumb to, the more Putin deters us, the more likely it is he will achieve his objectives in Ukraine. And I fear he's going to achieve them by grinding the country into the ground.
If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.